Hey everyone, Duke Nougat 3D here, and yes, you read that title right. Today we are talking about cheek filters and why they were not so terrible as we make them out to be. Now, I'm sure you all know that pretty much everyone in the community shits on cheek filter masks with bilaterally integral filtering elements in the cheek pouches, and from a civilian standpoint, yes, they are a terrible design because they are not easy to replace. They cannot be replaced in an NBC environment, and they're no longer in production because they are an outdated design, difficult to procure, etc., etc. But in a military standpoint, considered from the design period in which these were adopted, it was a very logical and very actually a decent design for its period, and I'll lead into this why. So first things first, we should talk about changing filters in NBC environments. First and foremost, it just simply isn't advised, because say with even a 40mm mask where you hold your breath and unscrew the filter and quickly replace it, no matter how quickly you replace that filter, there is a very high likelihood, depending on the concentration of gas in the environment, that you will be more than likely introducing a small amount of ambient chemical agents in the air in between that little gap between the inlet valve and the threads of the canister. And that soda bottle cap-sized pocket of air, depending on the chemical agent involved, is more than enough to incapacitate you or render you a casualty in general. So replacing canisters in NBC environments is not a very advisable thing. What is advised for an NBC environment is to maintain your position and fight for as long as you can until either the canisters begin to show signs of being depleted, at which point the men will be rotated to the rear in a safe exclusion zone where there are no immediate CBRN threats, where the men would be decontaminated and immediately replaced with available backup reserve men who have masks and protective equipment that are not compromised and ready to continue the mission. In other words, people don't typically stick around in gas-laden environments waiting for their canisters to run out. They typically they typically head to safe areas to get them replaced while other people take their place. And even so, from a civilian standpoint, civilians would be more than likely evacuating these areas rather than sticking around in full chemical protection just because they can. It is much wiser to escape the area and continue your mission when it is safe to enter it, rather than to stick around and just, risk your entire life on your protection alone, which, assuming it does work, isn't a very good idea for the reasons stated before. But anyways, as I said before, replacing canisters in an NBC environment is not a very upheld practice. And so, looking back through America's gas mask development, we really had an aversion to canister threads for a good chunk of our development history. From World War I, we were mostly just using canisters which were wired and taped onto the end of a hose. Why we did this is because simply the soldiers didn't need to replace their own canisters. We made canisters that supplied an ample amount of protection for a good duration of time, and when it needed to be replaced, we simply, handed the mask off to a technician who was qualified to repair and replace the canisters, again, using those rotation methods to send properly protected, fully capable men to the environment to continue the mission. So, from 1918 onwards to 1944 or so, we were mostly just using masks which had fixed filters on hoses, and even still we continued to see fixed filter hosed masks well into the 1990s. It wasn't until the invasion, the D-Day invasion, when we began to really take consideration into a easily replaceable threaded canister. Not because we intended to replace the canisters in the immediate gas-laden battlefield, but simply because being able to replace those canisters in under a few minutes rather than several hours was a much more practical design choice to get those rotations a lot faster and get more men to the front. And so we momentarily adopted threaded canisters, but we sort of decided that there was a flaw with them. They were very easy. There was nothing stopping an enemy from reaching over to you, assuming that you were in hand-to-hand combat. This is all theoretical, from unscrewing the canister, and not only that, but the canisters at the time added a decent chunk of weight to the mask and made them unbalanced and could potentially break the seal depending on how it was knocked around. So the development of a canisterless gas mask was something that was very much considered and looked into at the tail end of World War II leading up into the 1950s. In fact, we even see some very bizarre and really queer-looking designs, like the E10 series, quote-unquote, rifleman's masks, where the concept was we take two bilateral canisters and we sort of dangle them off the side of the eyepieces or hook them onto the helmet or so on and so forth, so that way the canister could basically just flop over the butt of a rifle instead of, just being fixed to the mask, and it would help reduce the weight of the mask in general. But ultimately what we ended up going through was the E13 series prototypes, which have ultimately led to the creation of the M17 series field protective masks. Now, the advantage to the M17 is that while the canisters were very difficult to replace, we weren't really expecting average soldiers to handle that anyways. Again, going back to rotation of men in NBC environments, where you had a technician or a specialist who would replace the canisters for you, or in this case, the filtering elements, and, it was as simple as that. We sacrificed the ability to easily replace the canisters for superior protection, because at the time the mask was very low profile. It didn't have canisters sticking out anywhere to get in the way of a rifle, and it was also relatively much more lightweight, and it was also very evenly balanced. The protection afforded, this is another rumor that goes around about these masks, is that the protection was only against tear gas or was inferior, and this is entirely FUD lore. This is not true whatsoever. The M13A2 series filtering elements were fully capable of protecting against all known CBRN agents at the time, and were fully capable of protecting a user for just as long as a standard canister, if not slightly less, but nowhere near the minuscule amounts of time that are mentioned. And really, this isn't an issue, because again, soldiers would rotate to the rear when their protection was being compromised or depleted and would have it replaced. So, that being said, the reason we kept the M17 in service for quite some time, this wasn't a design that was rushed into service, by the way. This was something that had been in development since the very early 1950s, possibly before. And so, the M17 was not at all a bad design for its era. It made sense from a military procurement standpoint, much similar to the M50 Joint Service General Purpose Mask with its very odd bayonet filters, which are proprietary and non-conducive to using 40mm NATO canisters, because really the military doesn't need to worry about NATO canisters, because with those bayonet canisters, it involves superior protection than what a threaded canister could, and at the same time, it's all about rotation of men. I keep falling back on this, but I really want to drive that point in for the people that really don't understand the concept. The average G.I. Joe isn't going to be responsible for servicing his own equipment outside of a very basic level of keeping it clean and making sure he doesn't smash its shit in when he fucking uses it as a pillow or something. So, again, that's really why I believe the M17 was actually a very good design. The whole reason the M17 series was replaced was not because it was an inferior design, but simply because it didn't comply to NATO standards, and we were really hoping to get back to that. And the fact that we've already gone and went against NATO standards again with the M50 Joint Service General Purpose Mask is kind of a weird thing to consider, but whatever. It's really our design choices to make, and looking at it from a military standpoint like that, you can understand why this design made sense at the time. So, just wanted to give you a bit of food for thought. The M17 series and any cheek filter masks in general were a very logical design choice for the time period. And so, I guess that's all I could really say about that issue. So, I hope that changes your opinion on, M17 bad, cheek filters bad, because really, from that perspective, they really aren't. But if you're looking for some, expecting them to protect you, that's when you can say for sure that they're a bad design. Don't buy cheek filter masks for legitimate protection in this day and age. I'm just saying historically they were not a bad design. So, that being said, I'm Duke Nina 3D. If you have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, drop them down in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.